Today I'm going to tell you the really fascinating story of Karen Ann Quinlan, a 21-year-old woman in suburban New Jersey who went into an irreversible coma and whose parents, after 6 months, wanted to let her die, but whose parents faced huge roadblocks in doing so. I'm Gregory Pence. I'm a bioethicist at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, and this is Great Stories in Bioethics. So there's a couple of misconceptions about this case that I want to emphasize. And I also, if you're about Karen's age, there's a lesson here I want to teach you that may save your life. That's a big claim, but listen up. We know that Karen was out partying, maybe a post-birthday party. We know she knocked back at least 3 drinks. That's what her friends told police. Sometimes friends don't tell the whole truth to police. One misconception is we don't know why she went into a coma. We do know why she went into a coma. And what maybe her friends didn't tell police is that she had benzodiazepines like Ativan and barbiturates like Percodan in her system. What a lot of young people don't know is you can't mix alcohol and these drugs. It's like 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4, it equals 16 in terms of the depressive effects on your lungs and breathing. Anything touched with fentanyl or that terrible thing tranq and alcohol potentiates these drugs, will knock you out and make your breathing stop. And when your breathing stops, your brain stops getting oxygenated blood, and the next thing you know, big hunks of your brain start to die. So Karen stopped breathing for at least 30 minutes, maybe more. Hard to know exactly when she was found. EMTs took her to St. Clair's Hospital in suburban New Jersey, which was a Catholic hospital run by a head nurse who was a nun. And there she was immediately put on a small ventilator, and after a little bit they did a tracheotomy hole and put her on a much larger ventilator. They also put a feeding tube in her to give her body nutrients. Now, the second misconception about this case is that people like Karen in comas are sleeping beauties. Karen is in what's later to be called persistent vegetative state. People in persistent vegetative state are not sleeping beauties. We'll later see that also with Terry Schiavo. When Karen's sister visited her, she said her head sometimes was in a whirlpool, and sometimes the large ventilator would make Karen gasp, and sometimes her arms would flail. Her pupils were very dilated, as if she had had an eye exam. It was not a happy thing to experience for the family. After 6 months of this, Julia Quinlan, Karen's mother, told the head nun that Karen had once told her that she would not want to be a vegetable on a machine. This is very similar to what we're going to hear later in the case of Terry Schiavo, where after Terry has been in a persistent vegetative state for a long time, her husband reports a similar statement from Terry. At this point, there's kind of a huge moment in the case because the nun refuses to take her off the ventilator. And the attending doctor, whose name is Robert Morse, said he's uncomfortable taking her off the ventilator. And perhaps understandably, because at the time, a good number of people in medicine considered taking people off ventilators or feeding tubes to be euthanasia. A fancy name for murder. So they had to go before a local judge. We see there's a problem that for a lot of 21-year-olds, there was no advance directive. Karen had never written one or given one, so there was no legal way to know exactly what Karen would have wanted in this situation. Instead, the judge had to rely on what the parents said they had once heard Karen say, which in the law is called substituted judgment. That's tricky because sometimes people kind of make things up, or sometimes they misremember, or sometimes they just project what they want onto the case. So the judge rejected substituted judgment, and the parents appealed. And in this case, the New Jersey Supreme Court heard it on direct review, partially because there'd been a lot of publicity and there was a lot of concern about a case that might set a precedent. 2 neurologists testified, One said that Karen was like, quote, an anencephalic monster, just brainstem activity, but nothing upstairs. Another said that there was no light bulb in there was no one home, she would never come out of this state. We now know later that that was a little premature. In one study of long-term patients in persistent vegetative state, 1 in 63 come out some. After 3 years, no one comes out, but they didn't know that at the time. Anyway, the New Jersey Supreme Court justices let some other doctors come and argue, and they asked the other doctors, well, what if you just didn't put her on the ventilator in the first place? Would that be okay? And the doctors said yes. And then the justices said, well, what's the difference between not putting her on the ventilator and taking her off? And the doctor said, well, taking her off is euthanasia, but not putting her on is just foregoing. And the justices thought, that's rather flimsy reasoning. Well, across the Hudson River at NYU, a philosopher named James Rachels agreed. He wrote one of the most famous articles in ethics. It was called Active and Passive Euthanasia, and indirectly it was stimulated by this case. And basically he took the essence of two kinds of moral theories, deontology, which emphasizes motives or intentions, and consequentialism, which emphasizes consequences or results. And he said, look, if not putting her on the ventilator is the intention is death, if taking her off the ventilator and the intention is death, if taking her off the ventilator, the result is death, and not putting her on the ventilator, the result is death, then in terms of theories that emphasize either intentions or results, there's no moral difference between the two. That became a really famous article. It's probably the most reprinted article in ethics. And it also stimulated a huge industry in commenting and refining a distinction that today is called the acts and omissions doctrine. So the justices allowed the Quinlans to remove the ventilator from Karen, and it gave the hospital, the nurses, the doctors, complete legal immunity for doing so. And now we get to a kind of second wow moment in the case, because when Mrs. Quinlan went to the head nun and asked her to remove the ventilator, the head nun looked Mrs. Quinlan in the eye and said, Julia, you don't understand. We're a Catholic hospital. We don't kill people here. And Dr. Morse, the attending, he also felt uncomfortable. And he had said, I have to live with this the rest of my life, and I can't live with it. So he instructed his resident and his pulmonary fellow to do something that in retrospect is a little extraordinary. They started to wean Karen from the respirator. Now they may have also been thinking about something else, because up in Boston, about the same time, a young resident, very much like them, had taken a very large fetus, which might have been a person, and killed it and during an abortion. And he had been convicted of manslaughter. So I'm sure these residents had heard about this and were thinking, wow, Karen is in some ways legally still a person, and they're asking us to render her into a cadaver. We don't want to do it. So after a month, built up her lungs, and 14 months after she went into a coma, she was breathing on her own, and New Jersey transferred her to a Medicaid nursing home. Now, Medicaid is the fund that pays for poor people. It's not Medicare, which is the federal program that pays for medical care of people over 65. Karen's body stays there for another 10 years. She finally dies because Mrs. Quinlan, when Karen gets a lung infection, decides not to give antibiotics. In June of 1986, Karen's body expires. In my own life, I was unemployed when Karen went into her coma in New Jersey. I was across the river at NYU in Manhattan. And in January of '76, I came to UAB on a temporary appointment. And at UAB, there was a dean, Jim Pittman, who had been very interested in philosophy at Davidson College. He almost was a philosophy major, but the last minute he decided he'd major in biology because that had a better chance of getting him into medical school. But he had followed this case intensely, and he thought that because of the abortion ruling, in this case, medical students should have a course in medical ethics. He created a position, he had a national search, and I was hired to do the job. And so, starting in 1977, I was teaching 167 first-year medical students a course in medical ethics. Dean Pittman was also very impressed that Jim Rachels had published this article in the New England Journal of Medicine. First time a philosopher had ever done so. We both helped recruit Jim to UAB, where he became chair, later dean, and distinguished university professor. Jim and I actually had a very nice 25-year relationship. He helped me in a lot of ways. I think it's appropriate that the Quinlan case is often regarded as one of the key cases that started modern bioethics, because as the late bioethicist Christian Engelhardt said, death and dying is the quintessential issue of bioethics, and it sure hasn't gone away. 50 years later, we're just as befuddled with death and dying, and Americans die just as badly as they have 50 years ago. Why that's so is a story for some more episodes, but unfortunately I think it's true. I hope you like this story. I hope you learned something from it. If you did, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe. That's it. Until next Tuesday.